Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Bible, nations, and the Tower of Babel in our continuing study of world civilizations. Genesis chapter 10 begins. Now, these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and the sons were born to them after the flood. So it introduces what's going to be an entire collection of genealogies and connections of the family of Noah. If we look at it on a map, and I'm painting with a very, very broad brush, because those generations are going to spill out over all sorts of other areas. But largely, we're going to see a lot of the descendants of Japheth settle in either Europe or Asia, especially Western Asia. Although there's going to be exceptions to this, so we'll look more specifically in just a moment. Then the descendants of Shem we're going to see for the most part in the Middle East. And finally, the descendants of Ham, again, for the most part, with some exceptions, we're going to see them described as the people that will have settled in Africa, both northern as well as Africa further south, but also in Canaan. We'll see that in just a moment. So, to get more specific, as we trace through, and I'm not going to read all of Genesis chapter 10, but we have Japheth. According to Jewish tradition, people like Gomer, which would settle in the areas that we think of as Northern Europe. Magog was a term that was used to describe, according to Josephus, the Scythians. Madai, which is another term for the Medes. Yavin is their term, the Hebrew term for what we call Greece, probably includes the Macedonians, anybody in the Greek area. Tubal, also to the area to the north and east of the Black Sea. Meshech and Tiras being a term for I'm having a senior moment here, um, the area to the east of Macedon, and it'll come to me in about 5 minutes. Uh, as far as the descendants of Ham, we have Cush is the area to the south of Egypt. Well, Mitzrayim was the Egyptian and still is the Egyptian term. I'm sorry, the Hebrew term for Egypt. If you say it largely in the same way in Arabic. So if you go to Egypt today and are speaking to somebody who speaks Arabic, they'll refer to their country of Mitzar. Although the ancient Egypts called it by a different title, they called it Kemet. You have Put, and we also mentioned Canaan from the land of Canaan. Now, chapter 10, verse 8. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. Notice we didn't put Nimrod on that list. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Notice I didn't talk about the descendants of Nimrod because we're not given that, but we are given this one son of Cush named Nimrod. And notice he's going to begin there. He's going to develop a infamous reputation. Verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. We're going to read more about Babel when we get to chapter 11 of Genesis. But Babel and Erech. Now, Erech is in southern Mesopotamia, and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar, and Shinar is the term for Mesopotamia. So these are all cities, and each of these are cities, and some of them we know exactly where they are. Some of them we're a little less sure. Verse 11, from that land he went forth into Syria. Assyria is the northern part of Mesopotamia, especially on the Tigris River, and built Nineveh and Rehoboth, Ir, and Calah and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Now, Nimrod's entire career, at least insofar as described here, is going to be taken, and we begin with Babel. These are all in Mesopotamia. So we have Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and then to the north, Nineveh, which of course embraces Assyria. And next we come to Shem. With Shem, we're going to have Elam. Now, the Elamites live to the east of Mesopotamia. You have Asher, that's another term, that's actually one of the areas of northern Mesopotamia, and that's how we get the term Assyria, for that's Asher. We have Lud in southern Anatolia. We have Aram, the Arameans, and remember that portions of the Bible, portions of the book of Daniel, for example, and a little tiny section over in the book of Ezra are written in Aramaic. Aramaic is very close to Hebrew. They're not exactly the same language, but they are close. And indeed, the way we read Hebrew, the way we read and write Hebrew today, are by using the old Aramaic letters. So they actually borrow each other's alphabet. Now, in Genesis chapter 10, we see the listing of these nations. When we move now to Genesis chapter 11, it is the division of the nations. In chapter 11, or chapter 10, it tells us what happened. In chapter 11, it tells us how it happened. And so, chapter 11, verse 1, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Verse 2, it came about as they journeyed east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar. We mentioned Shinar is what we call Mesopotamia. It's the land between those two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. And they settled there. Verse 3, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone. Now, by referencing that, remember, this is written, it's written about people in Mesopotamia, but it's written to people who had come out of Egypt. And so you have a very different geographical mindset and they're both sort of flat lands, but in Mesopotamia, you have the Mesopotamian Valley, which has a lot of dried and sometimes not so dried the further south you go, mud and salt deposits. Not a lot in the way of stone unless you go up into the Zagros Mountains. Meanwhile, in Egypt, yes, you have that the Nile Valley, but on either side of the Nile Valley, especially around the area of Memphis and the Giza Plateau, you have lots of stone. So when you want to do building in Egypt, you have a choice. You can either use the mud brick, and there's places where they did that, or you can use the stone. In Mesopotamia, your options are more limited. So notice, it says, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they use brick, notice, for stone, brick instead of stone because they didn't have stone available. And so when we look, for example, at the pyramids, the pyramids are going to be made of stone, especially when we think of the Great Pyramid and the pyramids of the uh, the early kingdom period, the Old Kingdom. Now, the Egyptians are actually going to try in the 12th dynasty to sort of make a comeback and do a few more pyramids, but they're going to make some of those, I think, if I understand correctly, of brick, and that's not going to work very well. And those pyramids you almost can't find. You might find a big sort of mound of just mud, but they've completely disintegrated. But notice they were using brick for stone. You can do that in Mesopotamia because you've got areas that are drier and aren't so subject to local flooding as the Egyptian Nile Valley is regularly flooded, used to be flooded every year. They've stopped that with the creation of the Aswan Dam back in modern times. Verse 4, they said, come, let us build for ourselves a tower and a city and a city and a tower whose top will reach. And notice the words will reach are italicized in our translation. That is, our translators letting us know they added that phrase into the text to try to help us. And when you're moving from one language to another, you often have to do that sort of thing. And those are usually very helpful. Maybe in this case, it's not quite as helpful as it might seem because I'm not sure that the tower, its top was supposed to reach into heaven, but rather it might have been either dedicated to the heavens or having to do with the heavens. That is, it's going to be up in the sky for sure. But this idea of building a tower with its top oriented or having to do with the sky and signs of the zodiac and things like that, that's going to maybe not be a stairway to heaven to try to get into heaven. Although the stairway symbolism is going to be there. Um, and so they're making this tower, and notice, let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, this idea of a temple tower is going to catch on all throughout Mesopotamia, not just at this initial city of what we think of as Babel. And so what we're looking at is a artist conception of a ziggurat. We don't have to depend upon an artist conception. Actually, I had a friend a number of years ago sent me this email. I don't know if he took this picture himself. I'm not sure where it exactly came from. I've seen it posted on the internet since then. Um, he was in Baghdad, or he was at least in the Middle East. I don't know if it was Baghdad, but he was with United States forces in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, and sent me this. And this is actually a photo of the ziggurat of Ur. Notice the plane in the background. This is a modern day photograph. Verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us, and you notice there's sort of a divine council taking place. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them, and the way the Lord scatters them here in this passage seems to be by the shifting of languages from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, and there's a little bit of a play on words. Babel, because there the Lord Baleled, and there's a Hebrew word that sounds, the word Balel is to confuse. It was called Babel because he Baleled the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're given to understand that, for example, English popped into being at that time, and Greek and Spanish and every single language that exists today. No, but there does seem to have been a confusion of root languages from which there have been further subdivisions over the many thousands of years. For example, English is in a Indo-European, or if I can actually trace it back to a biblical term, the descendants of Japheth, both English and Spanish and Greek and Latin, and I'm given to understand Sanskrit, although I don't know a word of Sanskrit. And so a number of those languages are all joined together into one common family, and the same can be said by the Semitic languages. And it's not a designation. I'm not sure how much they're using it today, but as recently as 150 years ago, they were designating a third language group known as Hamitic. I'm not sure if that designation is still stylish today among philologists. And if you ask me where did some of the languages like the Far East, Chinese come from, I don't know. I'm assuming it's related to one of those three basic groupings, but I'm not going to try to trace that down. Now, at this point, I have to ask a question. What is the difference between Babel versus Babylon? And it's sort of a trick question because the truth is that the Hebrew text reads exactly the same all throughout the Old Testament. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Now, when you get to the New Testament, you're going to see the word Babylon. Of course, it's in Greek, and Greeks like to change. They like to Hellenize, or I guess this is bad Greek, but I'm going to say it anyway. Greekize or Grecianize, maybe that works. Their words, just like sometimes in English we like to anglicize certain words. But in the Hebrew text, Babel and Babylon are identical for some unknown reason. The translators rendered it Babel here, and then everywhere else you see the same Hebrew word in the Old Testament, they're going to render it Babylon. Shame on them. So I want to clear that up. We're not talking about two different places. It's the same place with actually the same name, but in the English translation, they have been rendered differently. So you have these major language groupings. Indo-European corresponds to Japheth, like we said, English, Spanish, Greek, German, French, Latin, Italian, and others. The Semitic, that corresponds to Shem, such as Hebrew, Arabic, Akkadian, Aramaic. And then Hamitic corresponds to Ham. And the ones that we mentioned here, Egyptian, Berber, Cushite, and Cadic, but maybe many more that are subdivided, and again, I'm not going to try to go to every language in the world. Did some languages develop independently of others? In other words, was the idea of language, did it spring out by itself in all sorts of different parts of the world I don't know anyone that actually, even if they don't believe in the Bible, I'm not sure if anyone actually believes that. I think that most would agree that the idea of speaking came from one common ancestor and then subdivided from there. Now, Genesis chapter 5 gives us a genealogy. It goes from Adam all the way down to Noah. He's the 10th, and then Noah has three sons. And then Genesis chapter 11 also gives us another genealogy, picking up with one of the sons of Noah, beginning with Shem, and going down 10 generations all the way to Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Notice Terah has three sons. So there's a certain symmetry here to these two genealogies. I want to suggest that that is deliberate, and at least to some small degree, if not much bigger, that it is manufactured. And the reason I say that is because when you read Luke's genealogy, where Luke actually quotes the names that are given here, Luke adds a name. And I think it's legitimate. I think he's taken it from the Septuagint, the Greek translation. But to do so, you actually have to squeeze an extra name, and that would mess up the 10 with the one at the end having three sons. And so, for that reason, I want to suggest that the genealogy here is deliberately stylized. So, the Genesis chapter 5 begins with Adam, but is preceded, if you remember when you go back to Genesis 4, there's another genealogy of the antediluvian world, the descendants of Cain that are mentioned there, and that's in contrast. And then Genesis 11 is preceded by a genealogy of the post-diluvian world that we found in Genesis chapter 10 that doesn't have the dates or things like that, but just lists the different names that are given. So in both cases, there's something that comes just before this. And in Genesis 5, there's 10 generations, just as we said in Genesis 11. There are 10 generations that are listed. And Genesis chapter 5 ends with the birth of three sons, as does Genesis 10. This is, as I said, a stylized genealogy. And that means we can't just try to arrive at a date, for example, of the flood. I think we can be pretty fair as to when Abraham comes along. I usually say around 2000 BC. I'm not trying to be exact. I'm painting with a broad brush. I don't think you can just add up the begats to go back to see, well, where does Genesis say the flood took place? I think it might be longer than that, if there are indeed, and I pointed out where there is that example of gaps in the genealogy, so that the number of years isn't totaled. The name and years of Canaan, as I said, he's the one who is absent from the Hebrew text, but he's mentioned in the Septuagint and in Luke's account. And as we said, Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 11 are symmetrical in form. The earth we're told in Genesis chapter 10, verse 25, the earth was divided. I didn't look at that verse. And I would suspect that that's referring to, you say, the division of the earth. What's that? Oh, well, that's the Tower of Babel incident. We're divided by the languages that were divided. And then the ancestral connections between people in biblical genealogies are often abridged, and we can see an example of that not just in Luke, but also in Matthew chapter 1. There is a genealogy, and it's also stylized. That is, it goes from Abraham to David, and then from David to the Babylonian captivity, and then from the Babylonian captivity to Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus, and then it makes a summation. So there's 14 generations between each of those sections, but to get to 14. Um, in that middle section, there's actually the omission of about four names from the genealogy, names that are mentioned back in Kings and Chronicles. So we know those kings were there, but they're left out, deliberately left out, so that the symmetrical form can be preserved. And in the same way, Matthew chapter 1 does this, I have suggested that Genesis 11 is doing the same thing.